They live hidden among jagged cliffs and forests so deep, even time seems hesitant to pass through. Tucked away in Afghanistan's rugged Hindu Kush, where the mountains rise like ancient sentinels, you'd expect to find harsh winds, stone villages, and the echo of muezzins. But not this. Not pale faces. Not children with green eyes, blonde lashes, and skin that glows under a high-altitude sun. It's a place called Nuristan, and what you see here doesn't match what the world thinks it knows. For centuries, locals and outsiders alike whispered the same legend. Alexander the Great came here in 327 BCE and left behind an army that never returned. They say his soldiers stayed, married, made children, created a hidden European outpost in Asia's sky realm. It's a good story. It feels right at first glance, but science says no. Because when modern geneticists took samples, not from skin, but from blood, bone, and ancient lineage, they uncovered something even stranger. These fair-featured mountain dwellers don't carry the genetic fingerprints of Greeks. No Hellenic trail, no Balkan surprise. Instead, they carry fire from the steppe. A massive 60% of their Y DNA belongs to R1a, a haplogroup born not in Athens, but in the windswept plains of the Eurasian steppe. It's the marker of ancient Indo-Iranian migrations, the bloodline of horse lords and fire priests, the very people who shaped India, Iran, and beyond. And yet, the Nuristanis are not Indian. They are not Iranian. Their tongue doesn't echo Sanskrit. It doesn't follow Persian rhythms. It is something else, something older. They speak a language that sits outside the two main branches of Indo-Iranian speech. A third voice, one that scholars couldn't place for decades, a linguistic ghost hiding in plain sight. So how did this tribe, perched in near-total isolation, preserve genes from Bronze Age warriors, while their words stayed alien to every culture around them? And more hauntingly, if their genes match the Indo-Iranians, why doesn't their language? Because next, we descend deeper into the forest of sound, where a voice survives that should not exist. So how did this tribe, perched in near-total isolation, preserve genes from Bronze Age warriors, while their words stayed alien to every culture around them? Because next, we descend deeper into the forest of sound, where a voice survives that should not exist. That voice belongs to a language with no brothers, no clear ancestry, no nation claims it, and yet it endures, whispering from the valleys of Nuristan like a ghost of something older than the empire. Scholars tried to place it. At first they thought it might be a dialect of Pashto, maybe an offshoot of Dardic tongues from nearby Kashmir, but it refused to fit. Its grammar, its sounds, even its counting system felt foreign. And then came Georg Morgenstern, a Norwegian linguist traveling through Nuristan in the 1920s, armed with nothing but paper, ink, and an ear trained for ancient echoes. He lived among them. He listened. He recorded. What he found would stun the linguistic world for decades. Languages like Kati, Waigali, and Prasuni, spoken by separate tribes across ravines and ridges, weren't offshoots. They weren't borrowed tongues. They were a third branch of the Indo-Iranian family. Not Indo-Aryan like Hindi, Bengali, or Sanskrit. Not Iranian like Persian, Kurdish, or Pashto, but something older. A branch that broke away, possibly as early as the 8th century BCE, and somehow survived. These weren't just dialects, they were time capsules. Inside them, Morgenstern heard echoes of Proto-Indo-European itself, the mother language of over 400 modern tongues. Words like tre for three, bem for him, sounds that once traveled from the Black Sea to the Himalayas, now only alive in a few hidden valleys. He called it a linguistic fossil, a voice frozen by mountains, untouched by conquest, quietly defying 2,800 years of history. And yet, it wasn't just the words that lingered. It was what they pointed to. Because where there's an ancient language, there's often an ancient faith speaking through it. And what the Nuristanis believed before the forced conversions, before their gods were burned, was unlike anything else in the Islamic world. Next, we uncover the gods they tried to silence, and the rituals the fire couldn't destroy. Because long before mosques rose in these mountains, long before the Quran arrived with sword in hand, this place had its own sacred map. A sky of thunder gods, a forest alive with spirits, and a high god named Imra, who ruled not with mercy, but with memory. This was Kafiristan, the land of the infidels. Not a slur, but a description. These were the last people in the region who still worshipped many gods, people who had never bowed to Mecca, who still sang hymns not heard anywhere else on earth. Their religion wasn't a fringe cult. It was a surviving branch of ancient Indo-Iranian belief. Their gods, familiar, yet twisted through time. Imra, a death god born from Vedic Yama. Inder, a stormbringer, brother of fire, father of light, echoing Indra of Rigvedic lore. A goddess called Dishani, fierce and radiant, riding the wind. This wasn't mythology. It was a living, breathing cosmos. Their rituals were raw, blood sacrifices of bulls and goats, fermented wine shared in copper cups, priests entering trance with chants, drums, and sometimes amanita mushrooms. They worshipped under open skies, not in temples. They carved their heroes into wood, ancestral statues that stood guard outside homes, watching for generations. They believed their gods walked beside them, in rivers, in rocks, in thunder. But it wasn't just Kafiristan. Across the mountains of northeast Afghanistan and into Kashmir, there was once an entire zone called Kafiristan, the land of the fairies. It was a cradle of Indo-European animism, a prehistoric religious world that somehow lasted into the 1800s, until the spring of 1896, when the Afghan king Abdur Rahman Khan ordered the invasion. His soldiers marched into Kafiristan and with fire and steel erased 1,000 years in a single season. Statues were burned, gods beheaded, ancestor poles pulled from the earth and thrown into rivers, and just like that, Kafiristan was gone. But even after the temples were ash, the genes remained. Because in the bodies of the Nuristanis, the rituals kept breathing, and that is exactly what terrified the king. In the winter of 1895, the man they called the Iron Emir, Emir Abdur Rahman Khan, turned his eyes toward the last unconquered corner of Afghanistan, Kafiristan, a place where God still walked, where no mosque had ever stood, and where the Quran had not yet arrived. To the rest of the Islamic world, it was an open wound. To Abdur Rahman, it was unfinished business, and so began one of the most brutal campaigns in Central Asian history. By January 1896, Afghan troops marched into the mountain valleys under royal command. The goal was not conquest, it was a conversion. What followed was a cultural execution, temples torn down, wooden gods burned or hacked apart. Over 30 carved ancestral statues, some centuries old, seized and carted off to Kabul as trophies. Village by village, they erased identities. Sacred feasting grounds became military camps. Priest kings were stripped of power or slaughtered. They even went for the trees. Ancestor poles carved with horns and mythic beasts were pulled from the soil and left to rot. The oral bards, the chut, were silenced. The name Kafiristan was erased from the maps. In its place they wrote Nuristan, land of light. A cruel irony. The light that replaced the fire was not warmth. It was control, surveillance, doctrine. The Nuristanis were forcibly circumcised, forbidden to drink wine, and made to recite prayers in a language they never knew. It was a holy war, disguised as unification. And yet, with every shrine that burned, something else refused to die. Because the carvings may have vanished, the songs may have gone quiet, but deep in their bones, the code remained. And what scientists would find there, a century later, would rewrite everything the conquerors tried to bury. Because what they couldn't burn was hidden inside the people themselves. Next, we decode that memory, one strand of DNA at a time, because long after the statues crumbled, long after the hymns went silent, something ancient kept whispering, not in words, not in stone, but in the very marrow of the Nuristani people. And in the early 2000s, scientists started listening. They took DNA samples from these remote valleys, and the results shocked even the most seasoned geneticists. Buried beneath centuries of silence was a living archive, a genetic museum. Inside the Nuristani genome, researchers found traces of Western steppe herders, descendants of the Yamnaya who once thundered across Eurasia in horse-drawn carts. And at the center of it all was a Y chromosome signature, R1A1A-M17, a marker carried by over 60% of Nuristani males, the same genetic beacon tied to Indo-Iranian migrations stretching from Eastern Europe to northern India. This isn't just a paternal line, it's a civilizational fingerprint. It links the Nuristanis not to Greece, not to Arabia, but to Bronze Age tribes who shaped the languages, myths, and even skin tones of an entire hemisphere. But that's only half the story. Their mtDNA, the maternal code passed down from mother to child, told an even stranger tale. Instead of South or East Asian lineages, researchers found mostly West Eurasian haplogroups like U4, R0, U2E, and J2. No East Asian signature, no Mongol echo, not even significant South Asian maternal DNA. This suggests something rare, a group that, for thousands of years, remained isolated enough to preserve both Indo-European roots and local hunter-gatherer ancestry. Even more unusual, this maternal pattern mirrors another enigmatic mountain tribe, the Kalash of Chitral. Like the Nuristanis, they live high in the Hindu Kush. Like them, they speak an Indo-European language, and like them, their DNA doesn't match the world around them. But another mountain tribe shares their DNA, and possibly their exile, because next, we cross a border drawn in war and enter a valley frozen in time, where songs, gods, and genes have never left. Just 80 miles south of Nuristan, across a jagged line drawn by empire and war, there lies a valley untouched by time. It's called Chitral, and inside it lives a people unlike any other in Pakistan, the Kalash. Like the Nuristanis, they speak an Indo-European language that refuses to fit neatly into modern categories. Their words carry the weight of centuries, shaped by mountains, preserved in song. But it's not just their voice that echoes the past. The Kalash still offer goats to mountain gods, still dance around fires to honor seasonal spirits, still brew sacred wine for their holy men and carve wooden effigies of the dead, just like the Nuristanis once did. And in their faces, you see the same paradox: fair skin, hazel eyes, chestnut hair, and in their blood, the same signal flare, the R1A1AY DNA again. The mtDNA U4 and R0 lines again. Geneticists from projects like the Genographic Initiative and Stanford's South Asian Genome Project have found a striking overlap between Kalash and Nuristani markers. Not just shared ancestry, but shared isolation. It's led to a powerful theory that both groups descend from an early Indo-Aryan migration, possibly around the 2nd millennium BCE. a time when waves of people from the Eurasian steppes flowed into the subcontinent, bringing gods, horses, and fire rituals with them. But while most Indo-Aryan tribes melted into the Vedic mainstream, some didn't. Some turned west, into the mountains. Some broke off and stayed. The Kalash and the Nuristanis might be what remains of those mountain-bound wanderers, two halves of a forgotten whole. But if they were once one, what tore them apart? Was it distance or something darker? Could these cousins have been split by conquest, not choice? Because next, we enter a war not of blood, but of memory, and what was destroyed when one tribe bent and the other refused. Because where conquest leaves blood, it often erases memory. And in Nuristan, memory wasn't just stolen. It was burned, buried, and silenced. By the time Emir Abdur Rahman's campaign ended in 1896, the Nuristanis had lost more than gods. They lost their material history, temples, gone, shrines, burned, graves, unmarked, desecrated, or lost beneath rubble. Even their bards, the oral storytellers known as chut, were broken by silence. Their chants, once passed from father to son, vanished within a generation. Today, if you search Nuristan for artifacts, you'll find only fragments. A few wooden carvings tucked into corners of hidden homes, lovers entwined in spirals, horses with twisted limbs, war gods mid-roar. A silver ritual cup, half-crushed, found in the Kunar Valley, dated to around the 17th century, but bearing symbols far older, symbols that match Indo-Iranian motifs seen in Bactria and Margiana over 2,500 years ago. Ruins of shrines, their stones scattered by avalanche or cannon fire, now claimed by forest and time. And still, no cemeteries, no tombs, no sacred ground left untouched. Why? Because during the forced conversions of the late 19th century, the past wasn't just forbidden, it was deliberately erased. European travelers like George Scott Robertson wrote of witnessing Nuristani icons smashed in public squares, sacred groves cut down to plant acceptable crops. Even museum collectors in Kabul admit that what few relics survived were either stolen or mislabeled. There is no central archive, no official preservation effort, just whispers. So when archaeologists today try to piece together Nuristan's pre-Islamic story, they have almost nothing physical to hold. As one scholar wrote in 1989, we are left only with linguistic and genetic ghosts. But ghosts don't stay quiet. Because while the carvings turned to dust and the stories were forced underground, something else held the memory. Something older than text. More resilient than wood or stone. But those ghosts are louder than ever when seen through the lens of ancient DNA. And next, we open the genome like a scroll and read what history tried to erase. Because what modern archaeologists couldn't excavate from broken shrines, geneticists pulled from blood, and what they found rewrote the timeline. The Nuristani genome doesn't just tell a story of Indo-European migrations or steppe herders. It tells a deeper story, one that begins before gods had names, before the Vedas, before the first fire altars were ever lit. Buried in their DNA is a rare ancient signal, CHG, or Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry. It makes up nearly 17% of the Nuristani genetic profile, and that is unusual because CHG doesn't belong to modern South Asia. It belongs to the Bronze Age world of Western Asia, to the lands of myth between the Caspian Sea and the shadow of ancient Mesopotamia. It's the same genetic marker found in the BMAC, the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, a lost civilization that thrived between 2300 and 1700 BCE. Think massive mud brick temples, fire sanctuaries, ritual vessels carved with serpents and suns. The BMAC was not Indo-European, but it touched those who were. And now, the blood of Nuristan whispers of that contact. It means these people didn't just carry the Indo-Iranian flame. They may have once walked beside its source spark. Their genome suggests a blend: steppe, Iranian Neolithic, and this rare CHG signal locked in by isolation, preserved like amber. And then there's the phenotype puzzle. Where did the light skin, the green and blue eyes, the reddish-brown hair come from? Some blamed Alexander's army, but the genetics say otherwise, because the mutations for light pigmentation, OCA2, HERC2, SLC24A5, are linked to both steppe populations and CHG heavy groups. In other words, the blue eyes were never invaders. They were already here. So when the emirs saw pale-skinned tribes deep in Afghanistan and thought outsiders, they didn't realize they were staring into a mirror of the ancient inner world. And now the question spreads like wildfire across the genetic map. If the blue eyes are this old, where else have we mistaken ancestry for invasion? Next, we go looking. Beyond mountains, beyond maps, beyond memory. For over 2,000 years, the Hindu Kush has been haunted by a myth, whispered through mountain trails, printed in colonial journals, and believed even by the people themselves, that the Nuristanis were descendants of Alexander the Great's army. It starts in 327 BCE, when Alexander's forces entered the region during his Indian campaign. Local resistance was fierce, the terrain unforgiving. Some legends say soldiers stayed behind, left wounded, stranded, or deliberately settled in the remote valleys. Centuries later, European explorers like George Scott Robertson arrived and saw something they didn't expect: fair-skinned tribes with light eyes, auburn hair, straight noses, and rituals foreign to Islam. The conclusion seemed obvious: Macedonian blood, Greek descendants. It was a story too poetic to question, until modern genetics stripped away the romance. When full genome studies were conducted on both Nuristanis and their southern cousins, the Kalash, scientists expected to find traces of Greek DNA, mitochondrial markers from the Aegean, or Y chromosomal haplogroups like E1b1b, G2a, or J2b typical of southern Europe. But the evidence wasn't just weak, it was non-existent. No uniquely Greek lineages, no signs of recent Mediterranean admixture, not even a statistical blip pointing to Hellenic ancestry. Instead, what emerged was a much older and more complex signature. The light traits, skin tone, eye color, hair, trace back to Bronze Age steppe populations, especially those carrying the R1A1A-M17 haplogroup. These groups, connected to the Yamnia and Andronovo cultures, moved south into Central and South Asia around 2000 to 1500 BCE, carrying both genes and gods. They brought alleles like SLC24A5, HERC2, and OCA2, mutations responsible for depigmentation that took hold and remained preserved through millennia of isolation in mountain gene pools. Even the Kalash, long romanticized as Greek descendants, showed closer genetic ties to Iranian Jews and South Central Asian populations than to anyone from modern or ancient Greece. So the myth of Alexander's lost children dissolves, not through opinion, but through molecular truth. And what's left behind is even more mysterious, because these people are not Greek, not wholly Iranian, not culturally Indian, and yet they carry fragments of all three. So if they're not Greek, not Iranian, and not Indian, who are they? Next, we chase the identity that never fits a flag, a border, or a name. The last tribal code is still echoing in the hills. The truth is, they don't belong neatly to any modern identity, because the Nuristanis are something else entirely, a surviving shard from a time before these borders, these nations, these religions ever existed. They are what anthropologists call a Relic population, a group frozen in both language and blood, not assimilated, not absorbed, preserved by centuries of geographic isolation and historical neglect. Linguistically, they are unmatched. Their Nuristani languages form an entire third branch of the Indo-Iranian language family, completely separate from the Indo-Aryan tongues of the plains like Hindi and Punjabi, and distinct from Iranian languages like Pashto and Persian. British linguist Georg Morgenstern, who spent decades recording Nuristani speech in the 20th century, noted that their grammar retained features found in Proto-Indo-European, the reconstructed ancestor of hundreds of modern languages. Words like tree for three, bem for him, these are not just phonetic fossils. They are linguistic time machines, and physically their features defy the dominant ethnic profiles of South and Central Asia. Cranial measurements documented in early anthropological studies show Europoid structure, narrower noses, dolichocephalic skulls, lighter pigmentation, aligning more closely with Caucasoid steppe populations than with neighboring Afghan groups. Genetically, they are a mosaic. The dominant R1A1A-M17Y DNA links them to Bronze Age Indo-Iranians. Their mtDNA shows maternal ancestry from West Eurasia, not from the Indian subcontinent, and uniquely, they carry a high percentage of CHG ancestry, a genetic layer almost absent in surrounding ethnic groups. Their pre-Islamic religion, crushed by Emir Abdur-Rahman's conquest in 1896, mirrored ancient Indo-European polytheism. Deities like Imra, Inder, and Moni ruled their sacred calendar. They worshipped in open-air sanctuaries, not mosques. They offered wine to gods, not water to prophets. But all of that, language, faith, art, memory, was targeted for erasure. What survived is not a culture, but a code. And today, the land once called Kafiristan bears a name that erases the past: Nuristan, the land of light. But there is no light on the temple walls, no shrines, no statues, only people carrying history in their genes. Can their true story be restored? Not through temples, but through time and science? Yes, because their genome is the temple now. When the shrines were burned, when the wooden gods were hacked down in 1896, when the songs were silenced and the language forbidden, what no one realized was that the real archive didn't die. It simply went deeper. Locked in the marrow of the Nuristani people is something few populations on Earth still carry: a continuous, unbroken genetic manuscript, written over 10,000 years of human history. The earliest layer begins with the Zagros Neolithic herders, one of the first agricultural societies in the world, thriving in western Iran around 8000 BCE. Then comes the imprint of the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, a ghost population whose legacy shaped the Bronze Age, now almost erased from modern Eurasia, except here. Followed by the arrival of Yamnia ancestry steppe nomads around 2000 BCE, bringing not only Indo-Iranian languages but key alleles for pigmentation, metabolism, and immunity, locked in today as the dominant R1A1A-M17Y DNA haplogroup. But this isn't just science, it's soul. That mixture, forged in valleys no army could breach, preserved more than blood. It preserved belief, ritual, and identity. The Nuristanis' oral traditions once described Imra watching over the dead, Gish leading battles in a divine frenzy, and Disani, a goddess of fertility with echoes of Indo-European matriarchs lost in time. These gods weren't myths. They were reflections of ancestral cosmology shaped by nature, fire, and the seasons. Even their faces, sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, golden brown hair, reflect not invasion, but inheritance, a mirror of who they've always been. So when Emir Abdur-Rahman Khan renamed Kafiristan to Nuristan, thinking he'd extinguished a pagan world, He didn't know that the entire spiritual and genetic architecture of that world was now coded inside the people themselves. DNA doesn't just carry the past, it remembers it, even when memory is outlawed. And through these people, linguistically exiled, religiously erased, something extraordinary survives, a story of who we were before we became who we are. But this is just one chapter, because to the east, across glaciers and monasteries, deeper into the Himalayas, another ancient tribe is calling, and scientists now believe their blood may preserve the first genetic footprint of early Buddhism. Next, we follow that trail, beyond texts, beyond faith, into the genome's silent scripture.